Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Sensibly Speaking podcast, bonus edition for this week. I had the opportunity, Jeffrey Augustine called me and said, hey, let's talk about tax exemption. And I said, hey, that's a good idea. And so what we are doing is an audio-only podcast bonus edition this week. So, Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Chris, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I'm always happy to talk about taking away Scientology's tax exemption. And I understand that you have some ideas with this.
Yes, basically I did a column with Tony last week. And long story short, in 1998, the U.S. Congress created a loophole in which it's almost impossible to get any church organization audited. And what happened prior to 1998, there used to be 4 regional commissioners in the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, who could call for an investigation into a church's tax exemption. That means, are they doing something that's not tax exempt? Are they engaging in activities that are not tax exempt?
Right, per the 501c3 requirements.
Exactly. And also something that's called the doctrine of illegality. For example, in a decision called Bob Jones, it specifically says the government cannot exempt any conduct with which it's charged with preventing.
Okay.
In other words, if you were organized to do commercial business or to steal or anything, you can't have that. If you said theft was a sacrament of our church, well, obviously you can't get tax exemption. And the court, the court even noted, the court even noted in that case that Fagan School for Pickpockets could be a trust if that could be tax exempt if that were the case. So anyway, the 4 regional commissioners were eliminated in the 1998 IRS Restructuring Act, which Congress signed into law. And so what you need. 2009, the IRS investigates a Christian church, and for engaging in activity that they're saying is not tax exempt, like inurement to the pastor, things like that. And the church actually took the IRS to court and said, hey, wait a minute. According to the code, the person who called for an investigation of us is not high enough to call for an investigation. The person who called, she was 4 levels below the IRS commissioner, whereas the regional commissioners were 1 level below. And the IRS code states that the person who can call for an investigation into tax exemption has to have sufficient constitutional legal authority to understand, to weigh First Amendment protections against tax exemption.
Okay.
So you have to have a sufficiently high person in the IRS or the Treasury Department. And so what it comes down to, surprisingly, shockingly, Chris, there are in the entire U.S. government, the big, sprawling, gigantic U.S. government, there's really only 3 people who can call for an investigation into Scientology's tax exemption.
And, this is the kind of drilling down to the details that people really need to hear, because they think that, a Senate investigatory body could do it, or a, state governor could do it, or their local representative could do it. And it's just not true at all. Those people just don't have that kind of power.
No, because and here's how it works. The IRS is a division of the United States Treasury Department. So therefore, the only 3 people in the entire government who can call for an investigation are the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, which is Stephen Mnuchin at present, the Commissioner of Tax Exempt and Government Entities, Ms. Sunita Lau, or the IRS Commissioner, Mr. John Kosakin.
Okay.
Now, I started a petition at change.org to demand that Commissioner Koskinen, open an investigation. And I've identified 11 reasons in my change.org petition that are very specific on why the church is in violation of its 1993 income tax exemption. And it's very straightforward. Just for example, its lack of corporate governance. The church told the IRS that it has a system of checks and balances, trustees, boards of directors, but David Miscavige is the managing agent of the church. The Church of Scientology is David Miscavige's alter ego. There are no checks and balances, as they told the IRS.
Right. One of many lies that were in those documents.
Well, the Church of Scientology also told the IRS that a matter of getting repayments or refunds were very easy.
Right.
In fact, all you had to do was ask and complete a routing form. And the church, it said that refunds and repayments were actually a quality control mechanism, because if somebody wasn't happy with Scientology, which is only a few people, the church said, then they wanted to give them the refund and get them out of there so that everyone else who was satisfied with Scientology could get on with Scientology. So they made it sound like, oh, only troublemakers would ever want a refund, so we'll give them their money and get them out of here. Easy to do, piece of cake. But let's get into the bigger issue, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
Why should Scientology have tax exemption to engage in harassing former members, critics, and journalists?
That is really where we start getting people going, what the hell? Because they see the activities of the church as we expose them and the abuses of the church, the really pretty nasty stuff. And they go, how is this acceptable? We don't care about the Xenu stuff is one thing. And you go, okay, well, that's kooky, but, so is the Mormons' magic underwear, right? So we don't care about that. But when they're stalking and harassing people, you go, wait a second, how is this tax exempt?
Yeah, how is it tax exempt? Now, they also use tax exempt dollars to create slanderous hate websites and videos against former members, critics, and journalists who speak out and expose Scientology's inhumane practices. And on Leah Remini's season 2 opener, we had 2 very courageous, brave young women who shared stories of sexual abuse.
Yes.
Immediately today, the church has spent tax exempt dollars to attack these 2 very courageous young women.
That's right. There are videos up, very professionally made, as well as the content of the website itself, which is all part of a huge website attacking everybody who's spoken out on Leah's show.
Okay, so why does the church get to spend tax exempt dollars to do that?
That's the question. That makes no sense to anybody.
For harassment, hatred. For example, why does the Church of Scientology, it spent a lot of money to follow Ron Miscavige Sr. for several years.
Yep,
it paid 2 private investigators $10,000 a week. That's not in the public benefit. Tax exempt dollars are to be spent in the public benefit. That did not benefit the public. Likewise, when the Church of Scientology paid 2 private investigators for 25 years to follow Pat Broker, that only inured to the paranoia of David Miscavige. That was money not spent in the public benefit whatsoever. You can't justify 2 PIs for 25 years.
No, because that ended up being like millions of dollars in fees.
Exactly. And so that's not in the public benefit. That's a violation, in my opinion.
Okay.
Now, the next thing, Scientology's abuse of U.S. religious worker visas to recruit non-U.S. citizens to work in the Sea Org. Once they show up, these people from outside of America, they have their passports confiscated and they're forced to work often 100-hour weeks for wages below the poverty level or no pay at all.
Correct.
So there's abuse of the religious worker visa system. There's also Scientology's use of these contracts of adhesion you sign when you join that strip you of all your legal and civil rights, and we've discussed those on a previous podcast.
That's right, in detail, and you've actually posted those at your Scientology Money Project website.
I have, because knowledge is power.
That's right, and just so people know where they can go see these things as well.
Now, something that's interesting is Scientology's use of child labor.
Yes.
Now, that gets to be very controversial. Does a church need to use child labor? No. Should it use child labor? No. Children should be in school getting an education. Private
Correct.
education, religious education, it doesn't matter. They should be in school being kids. They shouldn't be scrubbing toilets at Flagland Base at 12 years of age, as did Alexander Jench.
Exactly. Or being, uh, sexually assaulted by the people who are supposed to be educating them.
Well, exactly. And that goes back to one thing the IRS needs to look at is the system of cover-ups of sexual abuse and rape inside the Church of Scientology.
That's right.
And last night, Leah Remini and Mike Rinder really dialed in on that, and you could see the church's reaction to it today.
Oh,
trying to say it never happened when there's numerous victims.
That's right. And they've been working overtime over the last couple of weeks trying to, out PR their way out of what they knew was coming and with Leah's show. And it's just been one foot bullet after another with them. They're failing miserably like they always do on those because they come out looking like total bullies and numbskulls.
Absolutely. Then the next thing the IRS needs to look at, Scientology's predatory fundraising practices.
Yes.
The public doesn't realize that Scientology uses commissioned salespeople to raise money. So, for example, FSMs.
Yes, field staff members.
Field staff members generally get a 10% commission.
Yep.
So if I were a field staff member, Chris, and I regged you for $50,000 in services, I get $5,000.
That's right. And that's been a practice since the 1960s.
Well, you also have field disseminators for the IAS, a different
Correct.
set of fundraisers. They get 2% of the cut.
And I've heard of more when they go out full time with the tours and stuff around the country. I mean, those guys are raking in mega bank.
And what's interesting is what the tours. There's what's called Tours IC, the person in charge of the tours.
Mm-hmm.
The church told the IRS that these people are independent contractors who pay their own expenses.
Right.
And the IAS, the International Association of Scientologists, there's a pressure all the time to get you to increase your status.
Yes.
Now, you don't get anything in exchange. You get trophies, these glorified bowling trophies.
Right.
But the commissioned salespeople get a cut of the action. What other church has commissioned salespeople? I'm not aware of it.
Neither am I. Actually, that's a very good point. Because I've not seen that in any other church activity.
No, I grew up in church. I was never offered a cut of the action.
No.
But this whole idea that there's people with vested interests inside the church who will use every kind of inducement, flattery, threat, anything to get money out of you. Mm-hmm. And yet they're getting, and they have an incentive to do so that's not spiritual, it's financial.
Oh, now, completely. The money motivation is so obvious. It's the elephant in the room.
No, the next thing is the Scientology's use of this system of brutal, inhumane gulags.
Yeah.
The RPF.
Correct, yes. I have my own personal experience with that.
And I'm sure it's nightmarish.
Extremely. Plus the hole that Mike Rinder had to endure, Marty Rathman talked about, Mike Rinder talked about, Tom DeVock talked about. I mean, these guys, have laid out in detail. Debbie Cook. I mean, those experiences were absolutely hellish, in addition to the routine RPF program.
My wife, Karen, had a hellish 6-month RPF running around the pole.
Yeah.
12, 14 hours a day at the base.
Yep.
So people now the RPF is a thought reform camp used to crush dissent. And people in the RPF are often in prison for years.
Yes. I was on it for 3 years.
3 years.
Yeah.
Were you allowed contact with your family?
No. You're completely sequestered from family, friends, anyone who's not on the RPF, and you're not allowed to originate or speak to anyone or originate communication to anyone who's not on the RPF. You're segregated physically as far as your where you're sleeping, where you're eating, where you're working. It is a insane experience.
So you're stripped of your civil and legal rights.
Yes. You're never allowed to have more than $20 at a time on you. Your ID is taken away from you. Your social security card is taken away from you. Your credit cards, like basically everything that's in your wallet, you don't have access to. It's all kept in a safe.
And
So
that's so you can't escape. It's a deterrent.
that's right. It's a let's just say it's a very heavy discouragement from just taking a walk.
So you don't even have your own freedom of person.
No.
And which leads us to, the forced breaking up of families by Scientology's inhumane practice of disconnection.
Yes.
Now,
that's right.
Again, Scientology tries to say that disconnection is a choice made by the individual Scientologist.
Total lie.
But, this is a choice made with a gun to your head. Chris,
Yeah.
tell the listeners, a lot of new-time Scientology watchers, what happens if you were told to disconnect from me and you didn't want to?
Well, what happens is a great deal of force and effort is put on my head by the church's ethics officers. There are people in the church whose full-time job is to enforce the church's, ethics and justice codes. And so you will be sat down and I would be shown, for example, a whole series of reports and documents about what a bad person you are, why the church has labeled you a suppressive person. And many of these documents, of course, contain exaggerations, half-truths, and just all outright lies in the same way that their hate websites do. But that pressure is going to be brought to bear on me, and I'm going to be made to read L. Ron Hubbard policies about how evil suppressive people are and how I'm supposed to disconnect from, in this case, you. And then it will be made clear to me that, it's of course my choice, but if I choose not to, I'm also choosing to leave the church and all of the friends and family and business associates I may have who are in the church forever.
And that's tax exempt behavior.
Right.
This sort of coercion that goes on, this emotional blackmail. And, going back to the victims of sexual abuse and rape, these brave young women who survived, they were rape survivors. I applaud them for their courage. And it's just an episode last night on Leah's show that would bring you to tears.
Oh, it is a gut punch. It is absolutely, without question, the most difficult to watch hardcore episode of Scientology in the aftermath that they have produced.
And yes, it was. And something that Aaron Smith-Levin brought to everyone's attention today on Facebook is the church issued a statement saying that basically they don't share any privileged information about that, meaning priest penitent privilege.
Mm-hmm.
So if they have knowledge of sexual abuse or rape, if it's given up in a confessional session, an auditing session, they can't share it because they're so holy.
Yeah, right.
But they said if they learn about it outside of a non-privileged context, they will.
Yeah, that's not exactly how things go down in the church, but that's nice of them to say that.
Well, but what's interesting, it was an acknowledgement that if something criminal goes on and it occurs in a confessional setting, we can't share it. And that puts them in the same position of, as the Catholics had to deal with the hiding pedophile priests.
Right.
And so this gets right up to the edge of illegality and what's right and what's wrong, and what kind of church would cover up this kind of sexual crime.
Well, exactly. And it's the kind of church that cares more about its public image than it does about the safety and security and well-being of its individual members.
And this is why everything has to stay secret. This is why people go to the RPF. This
Correct.
is why people are declared.
Yes. And I'll just say right now, I know of 3 instances of people who internally were found to have committed sexual assault or statutory rape on a minor, went to the RPF, and were then kicked out of the church. But no reports were ever made to any lawful authorities about any of the behavior of those individuals by the individuals themselves, by their victims, by the family of their victims, all of those people. It's a whole little drill that they do. Actually, now that I think about it, very reminiscent of how the Catholic Church was dealing with its, criminal priests.
Oh, yeah, the parallels are there, and there are so many great majority of good practicing Catholics.
Yes.
So this is it's not an attack on the Catholic Church, the
Oh,
Catholic
no.
faith.
No.
It's what it is. It's identifying behavior. And look, the Catholic Church paid for its sins. You know, priests went to prison. They sold out property to make recompense to the victims.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make any of it right. I'm just saying they were forced to pay for their sins because they wouldn't do it themselves.
Right.
Now,
And that has not really happened to Scientology.
no, it will not. It will not reform itself.
Right.
And the vast majority of Scientologists are good people.
Yeah, of course.
So the whole thing is there's no protest against anyone practicing Scientology freely.
No, that's not, and that's never been really the protest. It's been the abuses that we've been discussing and talking about, and the violations of the law that we really have a problem with.
Exactly, given the conduct of the corporate Church of Scientology,
Mm-hmm.
given its factual misrepresentations it made in its 1023 application for tax exemption in 1992,
Mm-hmm.
it lied to the IRS.
Oh, repeatedly.
And it continues to violate public policy by breaking the law. It operates in bad faith by, well, one of the scams it does, it promotes monies on account. They say open up a flow in the theta universe, which is the equivalent of planting a seed faith by tithing, right?
That's right. It's the prosperity gospel.
So if someone donates $50,000 to monies on account, it makes it sound like you have money in a bank account that's yours.
Right.
That's not true. This is an irrevocable donation that the church does not have to give back to you ever.
Correct.
It's at its sole discretion, and generally buried in the language of its 1023 application, the Church of Scientology said requests for refunds and repayments. And a repayment is just money that you've given the church, say 50,000, and you haven't used at all. They say these requests for refunds and repayments are handled on a meet or abandon basis. So here's the devil in the details. If the church can get you to legally abandon your request for a refund or repayment, you're done. The money's gone forever. If they can get you to run through the hamster wheel of the CVB routing form, the whole goal is to wear you down, convince you to stay in the church, convince you to not get a refund. And here's what happens, Chris. If by some miracle you happen to get through, all the hoops they have you jump through, and you get a refund or a repayment from the church, you're declared a suppressive person. And when you're declared a suppressive person, your family has to disconnect from you. So the whole design of the Church of Scientology's financial structure is bad faith, is to take as much money as they can get and never give it back. No financial transparency, no accountability to parishioners, nothing. You don't know what your money's being spent on. Is it being spent on private investigators to spy on people? Is it being spent on hate campaigns? Is it being spent on empty buildings? You don't know. And this is why an investigation into the church's practices where people could come before the IRS and say, this is what happened to me. I have, they took my life savings. I took out a second loan. I spent my kids' college funds. They have $250,000 they won't give me back. They have $10,000 they won't give me back that I need to restart my life. Mm-hmm. These are the kinds of things an investigation would look into, the practices that are dishonest, predatory.
I mean, all they would really have to do, to be really honest, is read Tony's blog, look through the Scientology Money Project website, watch some of my videos, and that's, it's all laid out. This is not like hard to find stuff,
Well, yeah, I agree, but the power of first-person testimony before an IRS hearing, investigation into actual contracts and operations and what the church is doing that's not in the public benefit.
Mm-hmm.
that's deceptive, that violates public policy, that might be illegal? These are hard, probing questions that the IRS needs to ask in an investigation.
Agreed completely. And I know it would be more formal than just reading some stuff on the internet. I was just joking, but yeah, it is well past time for such a thing to happen.
Yes, and really, if the church loses its tax exemption, it loses its powerful First Amendment protections, and a lot of the abuses would have to stop. They would have to pay Sea Org members minimum wage. They couldn't lock people up in the introspection rundown or the RPF. They couldn't hold them against their will. They couldn't do a lot of things that they do. And so to stop the human rights abuses of the corporate church toward its own members, towards journalists, critics, former members, this abusive machine, this inhumane, brutal machine can only be shut down if it loses its tax exemption. That's why I started my change.org petition. You can read about it at the Scientologymoneyproject.com. And, all I'm asking people to do is sign the petition, share the petition.
And go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, let's see how far we can take it. I'd like to get 1 million signatures or more.
Well, exactly. And this means, for those of you who are listening, because there have been petitions before, and, a person could with some justification ask, well, Jeff, what makes this one different from, the ones we've done in the past?
Well, the answer would be is very specifically targeted to the appropriate official described in the IRS code.
Yep.
In other words, we're not just speaking in generalities. Because there are only 3 people in the government who can call for an investigation, I've identified specifically who those 3 people are on my Scientology Money Project. And the person most responsible is the senior official at the IRS. That is, the IRS commissioner has the constitutional authority to do this.
Right.
And so this is very directed. Now we know exactly who to appeal to.
Right. This is not an appeal to the White House or the executive branch in general, or or a random senator or state representative, which people definitely, can and should make their state and local representatives aware of abuses with Scientology. But this, I wanted to highlight the difference with this particular petition and what it's trying to do.
Yeah, and so it's very specific and focused upon the right government official. Because, like I said, you can contact a senator or a congressman, and they're all great to help, but this is the particular official. The IRS handles tax exempt groups.
Good.
On behalf of the U.S. government. So it is an action we can take. It's a way to channel the moral outrage people feel toward the Church of Scientology. Right. And I can guarantee you, if the IRS, they will become cognizant of a large amount of people seeing this. I can tell you from my sources that Alex Gibney's film Going Clear sent shockwaves through the IRS.
That is internally. A good piece of information to have.
Well, I know that from my sources, okay?
Good.
And they're high level. So the IRS does take cognizance of these kind of things. And this is just citizens. These are mobilizing. We are all taxpayers, Chris. And the Church of Scientology doesn't pay taxes. It uses the roads, the police department, fire department. It uses everything, the infrastructure of society, but it doesn't pay taxes. And why should it be able to engage in this onslaught of hatred, slander, vicious behavior and get away with it? People say to me, Jeff, why is Scientology so evil? How can it get away with being so evil? The answer is that it has 501c3 tax exemption, and if it were stripped of that, its level of accountability would go through the roof.
Right.
And that might actually make a better Church of Scientology if it had a higher level of accountability. And Chris, one point I want to make for people who are listening, if you're a Scientologist, Scientology and tax exemption are 2 unrelated matters. Scientology does not need tax exemption to survive. In fact, Scientology lost tax exemption in 1967, and didn't regain it until 1993, and it continued just fine. So the lie here is that Scientology must have tax exemption. No, it must not. You can audit people. You can get auditing and go up the bridge whether or not the church has tax exemption.
That is correct.
And in fact, if you were a Scientologist in a church of Scientology that didn't have tax exemption, you would have a little bit more freedom. You'd have more recourse. You'd have more say-so about your money. You'd have more choices. And so you would, I think, wind up with a better Church of Scientology. There's a case to be made for that. The IAS has a big legal defense fund. It's not, doesn't have anything to do with the church. So there's plenty of money to defend the church in the IAS.
Yes, more than plenty of money.
But yeah, there's probably about 1.5 billion. So the whole point is to think that the subject of Scientology, of going up your bridge through clear and OT levels, that it must be under the IRS tax exemption, it's a non sequitur. It doesn't logically follow. They were making clears and OTs when there was no tax exemption.
It's a very good point. In fact, yeah, for many years, they did not have that, as you mentioned, and it's really just for them. It's, you know, for the parishioners, it's a little bit of icing on the cake because they get to have a little bit of a write-off on how much money they're giving over. But for the church, it really is, you know, a matter of opening themselves up to being more transparent. And I think the key word that we've brought up here is accountability.
Exactly. They want those First Amendment protections so that they can get away with what they're getting away with. And it's important to note for people of faith, in faith communities, it's not good for the Church of Scientology to have tax exemption. It reflects badly on faith communities, on other faith communities. Tax exemption was a part of America from the very beginning. And the general view was that churches, religious groups, acted in the public benefit, and therefore they took some of the burden off the government. So when you had a soup kitchen or a homeless shelter, or you took in the sick, you did charitable acts that took the burden off the government to do it. But the Scientology doesn't act in the public benefit. There are no soup kitchens, homeless, there are no services. In fact, it's considered out exchange to help the poor, the needy, the sick, the downtrodden in the church.
Yep, that's exactly right. That public benefits test is important, and I wish we had that in the United States more thoroughly like they do in England, and I think this they're putting in with the Charities Commission in Australia. But for now, this is the right move, is to take on the Church of Scientology directly and forcefully and get the IRS to launch an investigation.
Exactly, and that's all I'm asking listeners to do, is to sign the petition, share the petition, get others to sign it, and let's see how far we can take this. My goal is to get it into the office of the IRS commissioner and to get an investigation opened.
Great. And I think that is awesome. And I back that up 100%. And I want everybody out there who's listening, who has ever wondered, what can I do? What should I do? And people have asked me. It's not like you guys out there haven't wondered about this. And this is a very easy thing to do. It is a sign it, and it is a share it. Get this thing around to friends, family, contacts, whoever, because odds are at this point they've heard of Scientology and they've heard of some of the abuses, and of course feel free to share with them, what you know about Scientology, and encourage them to, take part in this, because it's the IRS who will determine, what to do with this, but this is what is needed to nudge the IRS to get them to take that action.
Exactly, and I appreciate you giving me the time, Chris, to share on your blog, which I enjoy so much, and your podcasts, and I really appreciate you taking the time to help me get this information out.
Absolutely, Jeff. I appreciate the work that you're doing on this. It has been really championship work with the Scientology Money Project. I encourage people who haven't seen that site to go to it. That is ScientologyMoneyProject.com. Is that right?
Yes, that's it.
Excellent. And there's a link to that and to the petition itself on the show notes for this at sensiblyspeaking.com and on my YouTube channel. So check them out. And thanks a lot, guys, for coming around. Jeff, thank you very much for your time on this.
Thanks for having me on, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Okay, guys, talk to you later. Bye-bye.